we're now joined by Professor Dirk Kotze, political analyst from the University of South Africa. Thank you so much, Prof, for your time this afternoon. Now, this was the first time that the ANC essentially outlined its strategic framework on coalitions. Does this also, just talk to the shift in the political landscape and what we could expect, in next year's elections?
Well, he made it very clear, David Makhura, who spoke on behalf of the NEC, that they don't want to talk about next year's election and the possibilities of coalitions, but they want to confine it to a discussion of the local government elections of 2021 and the coalition governments that were formed as a result of that. But it is inevitable that it's going to spill over into what is the situation for next year, especially now during the question time, where there were questions about who are the parties that will qualify or be disqualified from the ANC's list of possible partners in such a coalition government. So it became a question also. He referred to, or he made the comments on the DA's so-called moonshot coalition, which is also directed towards next year's provincial and national elections. So it became, in a sense, sort of overlapping both the local government situation as well as next year's election.
Well, just talking about, David Makhura then, do you think he focused on the right things? I know you said he didn't want to talk about next year's election, but the reality is that they are facing a threat on their relevance. And of course, there is that expectation that this party will fall below 50% at next year's general elections. I mean, just looking at some of the things he talked about in terms of coalitions, saying that they want stable coalitions that has a national approach and not pursuing trade-offs.
Yes, but that specifically talked about in terms of local government elections, I guess. But next year we will have the possibility of some coalitions at provincial level. For example, Gauteng is definitely a possibility. Even in the case of KwaZulu-Natal, it might become a possibility also, and maybe in some other provinces. So there, I think the idea of a national approach for coalitions is something more viable than, for example, at local government level. That has been the approach of mainly the DA's, as well as the EFF and the Freedom Front Plus and others approach towards coalition formation in the past, both in 2016 as well as in 2021. And we've seen that there are some problems with that because the conditions in different localities are different. And it is therefore not possible to have one type of agreement and it is applicable to everywhere. Because in some instances there are different parties involved in the coalitions. Not all of them are, for example, significant. And then the one point which he hasn't addressed, but which I guess is sort of underscoring all of this, is that ultimately coalitions are not necessarily, cannot be planned in all respects, because in the end it also depends simply on what are the results of the elections. And that will determine what are the options for the different parties in order to establish coalitions. We've seen it in countries like, for example, Germany. It's possibly the best example of where they had to form a coalition, which was not their first option in two previous elections or in two previous governments. So I guess that is some of the situations that we are going to experience next year, but for which the parties cannot plan at the moment because we simply don't know what the results will be.
The question there is SA heading for a coalition government. I would also just say that we are already in a coalition government era, even though we are speaking at, at a provincial level. But when we look at a national picture and just listening to what David Makhura was saying in terms of, having looked at the trends currently, even on an international platform, what does it look like for South Africa at the moment? Especially when you start considering already there are parties like the DA, for instance, that are going to form this multi-party pact, the Moonshot Pact.
Yes, I think what he suggested or proposed as measures, as principles of the NEC and which will become of the ANC over time, about certain changes in the landscape of coalitions in general. For example, that there should be thresholds for parties, that really small parties will be excluded from representation in it. That there will be, for example, there must be a separation between the executive or government, the political side, and the administrative side. And that the officials and the appointment of officials, that must become completely separated from each other. That there must be, for example, questions about the way in which that the party with the most votes is the one that will have the first option in order to form a coalition. Which incidentally, most of them are also the principles that the DA set out in their 5 principles, which are included in the private bills that's already in Parliament. That these things will most possibly, if there's still enough time, become formal frameworks for next year's discussion and negotiations for if there's a national election or national coalition or provincial coalitions. But the point is, my understanding of our law is and legislation is that it cannot work retroactively. So it cannot become applicable on the existing local governments that were established in 2021. And that will then become, because that will have to then completely reform local government to a large extent, especially its electoral and representative systems.
I mean, one would imagine that to have the strategic framework on coalitions that was presented today in front of the ANC, the party itself internally would have to, talk in one voice. I mean, if you look at just locally what is happening, the ANC's policies on coalitions have had great uncertainty, and experienced many instability in the different municipalities, including, for instance, Ekurhuleni and Tshwane. So how important is it that they do come in a united front even before they start engaging other parties?
Yes, that is for the ANC exceptionally important that they do this. And first of all, start to implement it where they are in the lead of coalitions. Like, for example, Johannesburg, where it is a party of a person of a very small party who's the mayor, and not the ANC that has the majority there. The same applies to Ekurhuleni. The same, in a sense, will now apply to Makhura city and other places also. So sometimes one got the impression that this was actually a policy that was presented to the opposition as if they are actually the coalition architects. But this applies equally to the ANC. And the way in which the ANC establishes coalitions and decide on how the coalition dynamics will work. So I think the first responsibility is for the ANC to apply it to itself and to those areas where it is at the moment the leading party in those coalitions. And then over time, in order to develop a sort of a consensus, even if it's not yet passed formally by Parliament or in a form of legislation, to develop a consensus about these rules of coalitions, if one can call that. But it is exceptionally important because the bottom line of all of this is that the public has become very skeptical about coalition governments. And that's very unfortunate. You mentioned today that there's about 80 local governments that are called so-called hung coalitions. That means one party doesn't have a majority there. But it is only a handful of them ultimately, mainly the metros, that are problematic. So it is not a disqualification of coalition governments in general. And one has to also concentrate on what happens, especially in the smaller places where these formations are sometimes working quite well.
Prof. Kotze, thank you so much for your time and your analysis this afternoon. Professor Dirk Kotze, the political analyst from the University of South Africa.